3 years. I paid her mortgage, covered the furnace, sat in emergency rooms with her. She called me a parasite. Your brother is coming with his kids. You need to leave. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked out quietly. And that night, I started paying attention like a daughter who was done being used. The next morning, 53 missed calls. The locksmith handed me the last new key at 10:58 a.m. on a Friday morning, and I stood in the doorway of the house I had kept alive for 3 years and felt not rage, not triumph, just a very specific, very quiet kind of clarity. The kind you only get when you finally stop being afraid of someone you love. I turned the deadbolt, tested it, turned it again. Then I walked into the kitchen, set a manila folder on the table, and wrote one sentence by hand on a yellow sticky note. Since I was good enough to pay for this house, I was good enough to be treated lawfully. I pressed it to the top of the folder, smoothed it flat with my thumb. Then I picked up my coffee, still warm, sat down at the table I had eaten at my whole life, and waited. By 12:38 p.m., my phone lit up for the first time. By 1:07 p.m., it had not stopped. By the time I finally looked at the screen, I had 53 missed calls. My mother, my brother Derek, my mother again. A number I didn't recognize, probably Ron. My mother, Derek, my mother, 53 times. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat, started the car, and drove back slowly. I wanted them to wait. I need to go back 3 years, because none of this makes sense without the version of me who moved into that house believing she was doing the right thing. I was 28. My father had been gone 4 years. A cardiac event, fast and cruel, the kind that doesn't give you time to say anything useful. He left behind a modest estate his attorney had handled quietly, a house in a suburb of Columbus that my mother had lived in since 1997, and 2 adult children who processed their grief in completely opposite ways. Derek moved to Phoenix, started over, called on holidays. I stayed, not because I had to, because my mother's hands shook when she wrote checks, because the furnace was old and the gutters hadn't been cleaned in 2 years, and someone needed to sit in the passenger seat when she drove to cardiology appointments and gripped the wheel like the road itself was threatening her. I stayed because I loved her. I gave up a 1-bedroom apartment I adored, exposed brick, good natural light, a radiator that clanked pleasantly in November. I gave up a lateral promotion that would have meant travel and 2 extra hours a day away from home. I moved into my childhood bedroom with its slanted ceiling and its window that looked directly into the Patterson's oak tree, and I told myself it was temporary. Temporary stretched, the way it always does when you're needed. I paid the mortgage because it made sense. I was living there. My mother's fixed income didn't stretch, and I had a good salary as a project manager at a mid-size logistics firm downtown. I covered the furnace replacement in January of year 2, $4,200, paid in full to Carlisle Heating and Cooling. I handled the roof inspection, the water heater, the broken sump pump in March when the basement flooded on a Tuesday night, and I spent 4 hours in rubber boots bailing water while my mother stood at the top of the stairs telling me to be careful. I was always careful. I documented everything, not out of suspicion, but because I am by nature a person who keeps receipts, spreadsheets, organized folders. It's why I was good at my job. I didn't know in those years that I was building a legal case. I thought I was just being organized. I didn't see the shape of what was happening until a Tuesday evening in late September when I came home to find a stack of school enrollment forms on the kitchen counter. They were for Westbrook Elementary. Derek's kids went to school in Phoenix. My mother was standing at the stove when I walked in. She heard me pick up the papers. Without turning around, she said, "Don't worry about those," in a tone so practiced and breezy that it landed wrong, the way something lands when it has been rehearsed. I set them down. I didn't ask. I wish I had asked. The signs had been there for weeks before I allowed myself to see them. My winter clothes, which I'd stored in the basement, moved, neatly taped in cardboard boxes and stacked near the foot of the stairs, as though waiting for someone to carry them to a car. I found them on a Saturday morning and stood in the basement for a moment, calculating. Then I told myself my mother had probably been organizing. She had never organized anything in her life. 3 twin mattresses arrived on a Thursday while I was at work. I know, because the delivery receipt was on the kitchen counter when I got home, tucked under the fruit bowl in a way that said, "I'm not hiding this, but I'm also not showing you this." I stood there reading it. 3 twins, delivered to this address. I asked my mother at dinner. She said she'd gotten a good deal and was donating them to the church. Ron, who was sitting across from me, smiled into his water glass. Ron was her church friend, a retired contractor from Gahanna with wide hands and the permanent air of someone who finds other people's problems philosophically interesting. He'd been coming to dinner 2 or 3 times a week for about 4 months. He always pulled out my mother's chair and always had an opinion about real estate and always looked at me just slightly too long, just slightly too directly, when the conversation turned to money or the house. "It must be nice having a built-in safety net," he said once, gesturing at the walls around us. He laughed after, like that made it a comment instead of an observation. I smiled and said nothing. I was very good by that point at smiling and saying nothing. The night everything cracked open, I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a pen. The shared desktop computer in the small office off the hallway had always been mine. I'd bought it, set it up, handled updates. My mother used it mostly to check email and look at Facebook. I sat down to print a work document, and the browser was open. Not just open, left open, mid-conversation. The way you leave a room when you expect to come back in 30 seconds. The email thread was titled Room Setup. There were 4 participants participants: my mother, my brother Derek, a woman named Barb, who I recognized as the church secretary, and a Gmail address I didn't know. I read it once quickly, not believing it. Then I read it slowly. It went back 6 weeks. Derek, in one message, discussed logistics of the drive from Phoenix, which route, how long the kids could handle being in the car. He asked about the bedroom situation, and my mother replied that the large back room, my room, would be perfect for the 2 older kids, and that the youngest could share with her until they got settled. My room. Barb offered to organize a welcome meal for when they arrived. My mother said that would be wonderful, and added, once she's finally out, the house can feel like family again. Once she's finally out. The room felt smaller. I was aware of my own breathing. Too loud, too present. I scrolled up. Derek wrote, just make sure Naomi is out before we get there. I don't want any drama in front of the kids. My mother wrote back 2 words. Of course. I sat there for approximately 4 minutes without moving. Then I clicked out of the browser, walked to the kitchen, drank half a glass of water standing at the sink, and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed, the slanted ceiling pressed down. The oak tree outside the window was dark. I did not cry. I've thought about why, and I think it's this. Some betrayals are so complete that grief doesn't come immediately. First comes the architectural understanding, the seeing of the structure, the oh, this is what this was of it all, how the mattresses weren't for the church, how the enrollment forms weren't curiosity, how the boxes in the basement weren't organization, how my mother had smiled when she told me she was completely serious, how she'd already known by then, for 6 weeks. I sat on the edge of my bed and understood the structure. The grief would come later. What came first was something quieter and far more useful: clarity. I went to work the next day as though nothing had happened. I am very good at performing normalcy. Ask anyone who worked with me during those years. I was the stable one, the one who hit her deadlines, the one you could rely on in a crisis. I'd had practice. At 9:15 a.m., I called Sophie Lane. I'd known Sophie vaguely from college. She was 2 years ahead of me, drove a sensible car, argued about everything, graduated near the top of her class. She was now a property and tenant rights attorney operating out of a firm on High Street in downtown Columbus, with 11 years of practice and a particular specialty in what she called informal occupancy disputes, the legal gray zone where family arrangements and housing rights collide. I sat in my car in the parking garage attached to my office building and told her everything. I was organized about it. I had my notes open on my phone. I walked her through the timeline, the financial contributions, the documentation I already had. Sophie didn't make sympathetic noises. She listened. When I finished, she said, "How long have you been paying the mortgage?" 34 months. In your name? Direct transfer. Her name, but from my account. I have every confirmation. Utility bills? 18 of the last 22 months. The exceptions were the months after my dad died, before I moved in. A pause on the line. I could hear her thinking. "Naomi," she said, "you're not just a daughter staying in a spare room. Under Ohio law, you are an established resident with documented financial contribution. She cannot remove you without proper written notice and the legal opportunity to vacate. There's no lease, but that actually helps you. It means you're not bound by one either. What does that mean practically? It means she needs to serve you a 30-day notice minimum. No notice has been served. You have protections, and given the financial contribution, you potentially have grounds for a reimbursement claim." My hands were steady on the steering wheel. What would I need to move forward? Everything you just told me, in writing, with documentation attached. Can you get me that by end of week? I can get it to you by tomorrow morning, she said. "Naomi, I don't think you understand yet how protected you actually are." I thanked her, hung up, and sat in the car for a moment. Then I walked into my office and did 8 hours of focused work, because that is how I am built. The next 4 days were the most intentional of my life. I opened a new individual checking account at a different bank, not the one my mother and I shared for household expenses. I transferred my direct deposit. I moved my emergency fund and my savings. I checked the joint household account balance on Thursday evening and stopped breathing for a moment. $4,000 had been withdrawn 2 days prior, in person at a local branch. I had put that money in, for bills, for the water bill and the gas bill and the rotating small repairs. Gone. 2 days ago. The same week they'd been emailing about room setup. I took a screenshot. I printed it. It went into the folder. Over the course of 4 days, I printed every bank transfer, every mortgage confirmation, every utility bill in my name, every repair invoice, Carlisle Heating and Cooling, $4,200, Riverside Roofing Inspection, $380, Buckeye Plumbing for the sump pump, $910, the January emergency service call when the furnace gave out at 11 p.m., and I spent 40 minutes on the phone finding someone to come same night, $2,100, including the emergency surcharge, all on my card. 34 months of mortgage transfers, 18 utility bills, a folder that told the story of every dollar I had poured into a house I was being evicted from. I packed in the evenings, quietly, in loads small enough to fit in the back of my Honda CR-V without anyone noticing. Books, the good kitchen knives I'd bought myself for Christmas, the framed print from the exposed brick apartment, the one I'd carried with me across every move since I was 22, my father's watch, which had been in the nightstand drawer and which I was suddenly fiercely glad to have in my hands. I found the apartment on a Wednesday evening, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building on Indianola Avenue, 10 minutes from work, with worn hardwood floors and kitchen lighting so bad it looked like a crime scene. The property manager showed me around apologetically. I said I'd take it. She looked surprised. I told her I'd have the deposit to her by Friday. I wanted it the second I walked in. I wanted something that was mine. Sophie delivered the formal letter Thursday evening, a 4-page document outlining my legal standing, the lack of proper notice, the documented financial contribution, and an offer to negotiate a formal reimbursement agreement in lieu of legal action. She walked me through it on the phone. "This is your opening position," she said. "Reasonable but firm. You're not threatening. You're informing. What happens if they don't engage? Then we file. But Naomi, I want you to understand something. In my experience, when people see documentation like this, the whole performance collapses. They thought they were dealing with a hurt daughter. They're about to realize they're dealing with an organized adult who kept records for 3 years." I let that land for a moment. "Good," I said. Friday morning arrived the way important mornings do. Ordinary on the surface, everything underneath. My mother came downstairs at 7:30 in her airport clothes, rolling a small overnight bag, because she was flying to Phoenix to ride back with Derek and the kids. Apparently the plan was for him to drive his SUV, and she'd fly out to accompany them on the trip back, the way grandmothers do when they want the arrival to feel like an occasion. She paused in the kitchen. I was at the table with my coffee and my phone. She looked at me with the practiced patience of someone who has already won, and she said, "Try to have most of your things out before we get back. It'll make the transition easier." I looked at her over my mug. I said nothing. Something crossed her face. A flicker. Maybe she mistook my silence for acceptance. Maybe she mistook it for defeat. She had been mistaking my silence for something soft for 3 years. She turned and wheeled her bag toward the door. I watched her go. The second her car turned the corner, I called the locksmith. Marcus Tillman of Tillman & Associates Lock and Security had come highly recommended by my building manager, and he arrived at 10:15 a.m. in a white van with his name printed neatly on the side. He was professional, quiet, and efficient. He replaced every exterior lock, front door, back door, the side entrance to the garage, with new hardware keyed to 2 keys each. I kept one set. I left one key inside the folder on the kitchen table. Marcus was done by 10:52. I handed him the check, shook his hand, and he left. I stood in the kitchen for a moment in the new quiet. Then I pressed the sticky note to the folder, picked up my coffee, and sat down. The folder contained, in order, Sophie Lane's formal letter on firm letterhead, a 12-page attachment of financial documentation organized by category and date, a timeline I'd written myself with corroborating evidence for each entry, and a copy of the email thread I'd photographed on my phone the night I found it open on the desktop. I hadn't been sure about including the email thread. Sophie said to include it. "Let them know what you know," she said. "The performance only works when the other person doesn't realize you've seen behind the curtain." I set my coffee down, folded my hands, waited. The first call came at 12:38 p.m. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. 12 seconds of silence, then, "Naomi, call me." She called again at 12:41 and again at 12:44. By 12:55, Derek was calling. By 1:07, it had become a kind of mechanical rhythm. My phone lighting up, buzzing against the table, going dark, lighting again. I flipped it face down. I drove back to the house at 1:15. I drove slowly, taking streets I knew well, past the elementary school where I'd learned to read, past the park where my father used to push Derek and me on the swings in the blue hour before dinner, past the dry cleaners and the little hardware store and all the textures of a childhood that had existed before. I understood what debt it was apparently being held against me. I turned onto the street and saw them from half a block away, suitcases on the porch. 3 kids, Derek's, sitting on the top step in the afternoon heat. The oldest maybe 9, the younger 2 a bit smaller. They looked tired and bored in the boneless, patient way children get when they've been in transit too long, and the adults around them are confused. I felt something sharp move through my chest when I saw them. They didn't ask for any of this. Derek was pacing the length of the porch. He had his phone up, mid-call, and even from a distance I could read the performance in his posture. Broad gestures, the kind you make when you want the neighbors to see you being wronged. Ron was at the front door, yanking the handle. Actually yanking it, like it might give if he applied enough righteous indignation. My mother stood near the garden, red-faced, phone pressed to her ear. I parked across the street. I sat in the car for 30 seconds. Then I got out, and I walked toward them, and I carried nothing except my keys and 3 years of documentation, and whatever I had become in the space between that Tuesday night and this one. My mother turned first. She always had good peripheral vision. "Naomi." Her voice pitched high. Not anger yet. Something closer to disbelief. "What did you do?" "I secured my residence." Derek ended his call. "You can't do this. These are kids. There are children here. I see that. They can come inside once the situation is resolved." "The situation?" He stepped toward me. "There is no situation. This is Mom's house." "Derek." I kept my voice level. I had rehearsed this in the car. Not the words, but the register. Calm, precise, not unkind, not apologetic. "I have paid the mortgage on this house for 34 consecutive months. I have paid for a furnace replacement, a roof inspection, an emergency plumbing call, and a significant portion of the utility bills over 3 years. I have been an established resident without a lease, which under Ohio law means I am entitled to proper written notice before removal. No notice was served. Sophie Lane at Lane & Mercer on High Street represents me. Her letter is in a folder on the kitchen table, along with full financial documentation." Ron stepped in. He was doing the thing where a person makes himself physically wider by squaring his shoulders. "Young lady, do you understand how completely unacceptable this behavior is?" I looked at him for a moment. "I understand," I said, "that you've been eating dinners in a house you don't pay for while advising me to build my own life, so I've taken your advice." His jaw tightened. Derek Derek said, "This is extortion." "No," I said. "Extortion involves threats. This is accounting." I looked at my mother. "The folder has everything. Sophie is available Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. I'd encourage you to have someone look at it over the weekend." My mother was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since I was very small, since the time I was maybe 8 years old, and I told her something true that she hadn't expected me to know. It wasn't anger. It wasn't quite shame either. It was fear. The fear of someone who has been treating a door like a wall and suddenly understands what they've been leaning on. I reached into my pocket and held out a single key. She took it, automatically, the way you take something when your hands move before your mind does. "The folder explains everything," I said again. "The children can come inside." I turned toward my car. Naomi. My mother's voice, smaller than I'd ever heard it. The voice underneath the voice. The one that had called me from emergency rooms and said my name in the dark when I was 12 and sick and scared. The voice I had moved home for. I stopped walking. I didn't turn around. "Naomi, please." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked down. A number I didn't recognize. Columbus area code. And beneath it, a name I hadn't seen in 4 years. Hartwell and Dunn, attorneys at law, my father's attorneys. The text beneath the number read, "Naomi, please call immediately. There is a matter regarding your father's estate that requires your attention. There are things about the original filing you were not made aware of." I read it twice. The street was very quiet. Derek had stopped pacing. My mother was still watching me. I looked up from my phone. The afternoon light was flat and gold the way October light is in Ohio. Warm looking but thin. The kind that doesn't actually keep you warm. The oak trees on the street had started to turn. I put the phone in my pocket. "I'll be in touch through Sophie," I said, and I got in my car. I didn't call Hartwell and Dunn that afternoon. I drove to my new apartment, the one with the terrible lighting and the good floors, and I sat on the floor with my back against the wall. There was no furniture yet. I was sleeping on a borrowed air mattress, and I ordered pizza, and I watched the city go dark through the window. I cried for about 20 minutes, which felt appropriate for 3 years. Then I stopped because I was tired and because the pizza arrived and because I am, at my core, a practical person. I called Hartwell and Dunn on Monday morning. The attorney who picked up was a man named Gerald Hartwell, senior partner, who had handled my father's estate in 2020 and who now spoke in the careful, considered tones of a man measuring words against consequences. "Ms. Naomi," he said, "I want to preface this by saying that I am deeply sorry this conversation didn't happen 4 years ago. There was a filing error during the original probate, an administrative omission on our part, that resulted in a portion of the estate being incorrectly allocated." My hand tightened around my phone. "What portion?" A pause. "The house," he said. The floor under me felt very stable and very strange at the same time. "Your father's original will," Gerald Hartwell said, "specified a joint inheritance arrangement for the property. Your mother was granted a life estate, meaning the right to live in the house for the duration of her life. The remainder interest, the ownership that becomes active upon her death or voluntary vacating of the property, was split equally between you and your brother." I did not speak. "The administrative error," he continued, "resulted in that remainder interest never being formally recorded with Franklin County. It still exists legally. The will is the will, but the title was transferred in a way that obscured it. It has recently come to our attention through an internal audit. We should have caught this in 2020, and I apologize that we did not." I found my voice. "Are you telling me," I said slowly, "that my father left me a share of that house? That I have been, for 3 years, paying the mortgage on a property I am a partial owner of, and no one told me?" "Yes," said Gerald Hartwell. "That is what I am telling you." I sat with that for a moment. "Mr. Hartwell," I said, "I'm going to give you Sophie Lane's number. She's my attorney. I'd like you to call her today." The next 3 months were the kind of months that feel both very long and very fast. Dense with motion, with paperwork, with conversations held in offices and parking lots and over the phone at odd hours. Sophie and Gerald Hartwell filed to correct the title error with Franklin County Probate Court. It was not instantaneous, nothing legal is, but it moved faster than I expected, partly because the error was unambiguous, and partly because Hartwell and Dunn, embarrassed, were motivated to resolve it efficiently. In the meantime, the reimbursement negotiation moved forward. My mother, faced with Sophie's documentation, initially insisted that the financial contributions had been voluntary and informal. Sophie responded with the email thread. There was a very long silence on the other side after that. My mother called me directly 2 weeks in. I answered, which surprised both of us. She said, "I didn't think you'd actually do this." I said, "I know." A pause. "The email," she said. "I know how that looked." "Mom," I kept my voice even. "I'm not doing this conversation. That's what Sophie is for." Another pause. Then very quietly, he talked me into it. "Ron, he said you'd be fine, that you were young and capable, and it wasn't fair that Derek and the kids didn't have space. And you agreed." She stopped. Yes, I had nothing to say to that. She had agreed. She had looked at me over her kitchen table, looked at the 3 years and the furnace and the 2 a.m. pharmacy runs and the emergency rooms, and she had agreed. "The legal process is the legal process," I said. "Sophie handles it. If you want to have a different conversation at some point, we can. Not now." I hung up. Ron, I later learned from my cousin Tessa, who remained diplomatically connected to both sides, had quietly stopped coming to dinner sometime in the second week after the lockout. Tessa, who had an enviable ability to extract information from everyone, said that he had apparently realized the situation was more complicated than he'd understood, which I translated as, he saw the folder and decided decided my mother's assets were no longer the uncomplicated prize he'd been circling. Derek called me once. He did not apologize. He said he felt like the situation had gotten way bigger than anyone intended. I told him that situations have a way of doing that when people make plans without telling the people the plans are about. He said he guessed that was fair. I said I'd be in touch when there was something concrete to discuss. He said, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "I think you made it easier to forget about me because I let you forget about me. That's a thing I'm working on." He was quiet. "Dad would hate this." "Yeah," I said. "He would." That was the closest we got to something real. I don't know if it was enough. These things take time that hasn't happened yet. The title correction was finalized on a Thursday in January, 4 months after the morning with the locksmith and the folder and the 53 calls. My name appeared on the deed, 23%, which was the remainder interest after the life estate calculation. I sat at my kitchen table in the Indianola apartment. I had furniture by then, a real couch, a lamp that wasn't terrible, and I read the document 3 times. My father had tried to take care of me. He'd written it into his will, careful and deliberate, the way he did things. My father, who kept receipts and color-coded his files and said measure twice, cut once about everything from carpentry to decisions. He'd thought about what would happen if my mother needed help. He'd thought about protecting both of his children. He'd done everything right, and somewhere in the probate process, an administrative omission had buried it. For 4 years, I'd been living and working and giving and sacrificing without knowing that my father had already accounted for me. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about what it means to be loved by someone who is no longer there to tell you, how their love becomes a document, a record, a thing that requires excavation, how you can walk through a house for 3 years and not know that it holds your name in its walls. I went to his grave on a Saturday in February. I stood there in the cold, hands in my coat pockets, and I told him about Sophie, about Gerald Hartwell, about the folder on the kitchen table and the 53 missed calls and the new apartment and the floors. I told him about the key I'd handed my mother. 1 key returned. I told him I was okay. The wind moved the grass along the path. A cardinal landed on a nearby stone and looked at me with the sharp attention birds have, and then flew away. I drove home. 6 months later, I am sitting at a table in the Indianola apartment writing this, and I want to tell you what justice actually feels like. Not the movie version, the one where the villain weeps and the credits roll over a triumphant musical swell, but the real version. The real version is quieter. My mother and I talk, haltingly, once every few weeks. There is a therapist involved. Mine, not hers, although I've suggested it gently. The conversations are short and careful, like walking on ice that might hold. We are not repaired. I don't know if we will be. I hold that uncertainty with both hands because it's mine to hold. Derek brought the kids through Columbus in April on a road trip. We had lunch at a diner near the highway. The kids are sweet, a little loud, a little tired, completely innocent of everything. The oldest one asked if I lived nearby. I said yes. She said, "Cool, maybe we can come back." The easy optimism of a 9-year-old for whom geography is still just a fun variable. I said, maybe. Ron does not come to dinner anymore. I have hardwood floors and terrible kitchen lighting and a lease with my name on it and $4,200 worth of heating equipment in a house I partly own. I have a folder in a filing cabinet, organized by category in chronological order, with tabs, that tells the story of what I gave and what I was owed, and how I finally, at 31 years old, decided those were the same thing. My father taught me to keep receipts. I kept them, and when the morning came that I needed them, they were there, organized and labeled and telling the truth, the way documents do when the people around them have stopped. The 53 calls sit in my phone log still. I haven't deleted them. Some nights I scroll past them on my way to something else and I think, that's the sound of a plan failing. That's what it sounds like when someone has overestimated how small you were willing to stay 53 times. And not once did I answer, because by then I had already said everything I needed to say. I'd left it on the kitchen table, in a folder, with a sticky note on top.